And now this is Mark chapter 13, verses 1 through to 8. As he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Teacher, look, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings." And Jesus said to him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, Peter and James and John and Andrew were questioning him privately. "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled?" And Jesus began to say to them, "See to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, 'I am he,' and will mislead many. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, and that is not yet the end. For nation will rise up against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. And these things are merely the beginning of birth pains, or birth pangs." So the Lord Jesus is coming out of the temple area, and the disciples say, "Wow, look at the temple, isn't it fantastic?" And Jesus says, "You see these buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down." And this happened about 40 years later in AD 70. And you look at the prophecy of the Lord Jesus and you think, wow, not one stone, will be laid upon another. Now, in AD 70, Jerusalem was attacked and the temple was burnt down. Now, I don't know if you've seen buildings, probably have, that have been burnt down. Well, you can still see the remains of the brick walls or the stone walls of those particular buildings. There is stones still laid upon each other. And Jesus said, "Not one stone will be upon another." Now, how can this be? Well, let me tell you, and the historians, I think it's Josephus, tells us that when Jerusalem was routed and all of the temple was burnt down, the temple was full of gold, and the gold melted and it went between the cracks all in Jerusalem. And of course, afterwards, the gold was very precious, and the people who came, they wanted to get that gold, and they threw down every stone so they could get to the gold that had melted and gone between the cracks. Jesus' word was fulfilled. But and it was a condemnation really of that whole system, because there was a new covenant. The temple was no longer needed because, as Jesus said to the woman of Samaria, people will no longer worship on this mountain or in Jerusalem, but God is looking for people who will worship him in spirit and in truth. And so the temple was destroyed. And in Hebrews it says these things are passing away, and they did pass away in AD 70. And the Lord Jesus here is looking at the buildings. Now, the disciples are carnal. They look and they think, "What fantastic buildings. This is something of significance." And sad to say, throughout Christendom, over the last 2,000 years, probably beginning in about the year 300 or whenever it became legal to be a Christian, people started building buildings. You go into local towns, you go into Shrewsbury, and there's buildings and buildings and buildings. It's as if Jesus, in John 10, Jesus says, "I come to give you life and life in abundance." It looks like, doesn't it, that Jesus came to give us buildings and buildings in abundance. There's an abundance of buildings. And Jesus isn't interested. He looks at the temples and he said, when the disciples were amazed at them, he wasn't interested at all. He said that these buildings are going to be pulled down. And he goes on, he says, "See to it. When are these spot that? When are these things going to happen?" And Jesus says, see to it that no one misleads you. And we need to be people who have our eyes fixed upon the Lord Jesus and not kind of be carried away with buildings. The disciples were, but Jesus wasn't interested.